Hi, this is Frederick. Welcome to the Epic Endurance Podcast, where we take a deep dive into endurance, strength and conditioning. Today we are going to talk about running pacing, namely with heart rate and with pace. So a smarter way to define training zones based on pace, using multiple points of maximal intensity, a bit the same way we did with critical power. I know that in other two videos I mentioned ways to gather your running paces. One was through time estimate on one specific distance, so that was the running time predictor. You could have used this as a way to gather where your threshold is. And then we talked about critical power, which can also be used in running. So using power as a way to define training zone is actually a very good way to go at it, because you're quantifying work and not necessarily performance. And we'll see in other videos that performance can be affected by a lot of things, including wind gradient, but also the kind of shoes you're wearing, and that does not really change the work you're putting, and these variables might actually impact the effort you're doing and push you a bit above where the adaptation might occur or a bit below. But not everyone can train with power, as power requires some specific tools like a power meter. So we're going to talk about two other ways. One simple way being used is training with heart rate. Now, like I said, heart rate is a byproduct of your effort, and it's not work and it's not performance. And effort can be affected by a lot of things, the environment, the stress you're having, if you're sleeping well or if you're not sleeping well, if you're hydrated. I find that looking at heart rate is great as a secondary metric. Some people use it as a primary metric for pacing their run. It can be done. It is not perfect. It is good for looking at recovery. So we are going to still, as imperfect as it might be, this can still be a good way to look at it. And I do believe that training with a heart rate is often a good way to lower slightly the intensity of your training. So for training with heart rate, we are going to try to keep it very simple. This is basic heart rate zones, and this is a very simple calculator where you're going to input a threshold heart rate. And the way you will gather your threshold heart rate is basically doing a somehow long duration, high intensity run. So if you're doing a 5K or 10K up to a half marathon, possibly something in the range of 35 minutes to an hour and a half, and you look at the average heart rate there, this is mostly going to be your threshold heart rate. Your heart rate, when it goes above threshold, you tend not to be able to endure so much and fade away quite quickly. So you're pushing your heart rate above threshold when you're doing interval training with little recovery, when you're doing sprint training as well. But usually your heart rate will kind of plateau and over certain numbers at high intensities. And this is going to be, to put it simply, your threshold heart rate, where your anaerobic threshold is. So the point above which things kind of collapse. And for this calculator, you're going to put this number. Here is 165. Now if I change this to, let's say, 170, because you're younger, and it will just simply give you some zones. So you will have your active recovery, something that you will use maybe at the very early stage of your runs or during your recovery intervals when you're doing interval training. You will have, so here, like I call this endurance here, maybe miscalled, but this is a kind of good place to train where most of your run should be done. This is quite a big range, but again, we only have 1 point. So like we'll aim for like 120 or 130 here. Tempo, this is going to be where your longer runs are done if you're aiming for achieving certain kind of performance. Threshold, that this is based on this value here, so max performance into certain durations, and max heart rate now plateauing up at 220. Some people might go above 220, but usually this is going to be as high as your heart rate can go. Now this cannot calculate your highest heart rate. Going for 220 minus your age doesn't always work. The only real way to go and find your highest heart rate is by achieving your highest heart rate during effort, often done into kind of interval training where your heart rate is never fully recovered. But this is not necessary, and this can be quite taxing. And for individuals that are undertrained or were formerly sedentary or a little older, I would think that going through these kind of intensities is maybe overdoing it, and looking at your threshold heart rate is maybe a bit better. Still, this is quite intensive. Now, this is one way to look at pacing. The other way would be to try to find your pacing not based on effort, not based on work with power, but based on performance. And the smartest way, I would think, to do that, and simplest way, is not looking at one point of performance, but in the same way we did with critical power, is to look at multiple points of maximal performance on specific duration. Now, in this specific calculator, I'm using not duration, I'm going to be using distances. What we're trying to do is basically look at the rate at which you degrade. I'm just going to show you. This is called the advanced running calculator here, and basically you're going to input a time on the 400. When you input the time, you should see the pace. So if you put, let's say, 120, and it's going to say it's around 3 minutes 20 per kilometer or 522 mile. I'm going to say a 5:55 on a mile. Around the track, that's 4 laps. And then we're going to say a 5K in 20 minutes and 21 seconds. And our target is going to be, for now, we say we want to do a half marathon. And it's going to give us an estimated time based on this curve. So again, this is not perfect, but it often works. I would use this, and I would use also the time predictor and look at what kind of differences we might have here and why. Again, this is looking at performance and not work, so there are also other things that we can change here. So we have a 1:35 time, and I added like a break bias. So this is adding a 5% increase in time duration when you're doing a triathlon, as 5% is a good middle line where actually performance kind of reduces. If you're able to do your best half marathon after a 90k bike, then maybe it was not your best half marathon. So there's going to be a decrease in performance when you're doing triathlon, especially long distance triathlon like a 70.3 half Ironman or a full Ironman. And for people, there's going to be some variation about how much of a punishment you're going to take on the run. This is going to be based on factors, like we said, the amount of volume you've been training on the bike, so you create less fatigue on the run. But starting with a 5% bias is usually within the range of what happens. And yeah, so you could see like basically on this one, we're losing about 5 minutes on a half marathon. Then also it gives you some training zones. So again, like we have the easy zone, which is, like I said, going to be maybe the first part of your warm-up, or the recovery runs, or the parts you're going to use during the recovery parts of interval training. Zone 2, properly named this time. This is going to be most of your work. Now we have a pretty big range here, because probably due to the data that I fed. Endurance, so at the endurance zone, you have this range as well. Threshold, good for training. Super threshold, which is just above, so you have a pretty small zone here, probably based on the 2 points that I gave. Super threshold is a great zone to try to elevate your threshold, which is your anaerobic threshold. VO2 max, and then power, so anything above this is going to be mostly neuromuscular power, and movement efficiency is going to be increased through this kind of zone. Now, suprathreshold, or actually threshold, suprathreshold, and VO2 max and power, these are things that are going to work mostly into intervals. You can play with the ratio of how much work and how much recovery you're doing. This will be for another video. But yeah, this is like a simple way to try to find again your zone and estimated time on specific races. Now, just to show you, if we're going for a full marathon here, estimated will be 3:22. And that's about it. I hope that this is helpful. I know this was a quick one, but I hope it goes to the point. If you have any question, please feel free to contact me. Have a great day.